takes more than being online to be a great online university. It takes time and experience. University of New England pioneered distance education in the 1950s and has been perfecting it ever since. With features like 24/7 tutor access, we're now rated #1 for teaching quality and support, and the only public university in Australia to receive a 5-star rating 14 years running. So, for an expert online education, choose UNE.
And I'm an Associate Professor in Agribusiness and Economics in the Business School at the University of New England in Armidale, Australia. In this brief video, I draw together commentary from various sources, including the World Bank and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, to highlight some of the potential impacts on global food markets from the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, most agricultural commodity markets are characterised by a high degree of price volatility. There are a couple of fundamental reasons for this. Weather conditions tend to be a dominant influence on agricultural output, and both biological and physical constraints in production mean that, at least in the short term, supply responses to changes in prices are limited. So agricultural commodities are naturally prone to frequent and substantial fluctuations in prices through time. However, when food supplies tighten and prices increase, food security concerns also increase. If global food stocks are low, these effects are amplified. The 2007-2008 global food crisis is a good example, when the prices of the 4 major food grains almost tripled, which pushed the number of hungry people in the world to around 1 billion. The problem was made worse by quickly implemented food protection policy responses, such as export bans and increased demands for food. Low-income countries are particularly exposed to food insecurity, as food accounts for between 40 to 60% of the consumption basket, compared to around 10% in advanced economies. But even in developed economies, food crises can increase wealth inequalities and lead to political, social, and economic upheaval. The COVID-19 pandemic presents extraordinary challenges for the global food system. Lockdown measures have already resulted in decreased demand for many goods and services, particularly crude oil, but not so for food. During the 2007-2008 food crisis, the problem was one of food availability. Currently, global production levels and stocks-to-use ratios of key food commodities are reasonably high. It's food access more so than food availability that is of current concern. Labour shortages due to lockdown and travel restrictions, social distancing rules, and transportation shortages are placing upward pressures on costs and disrupting food supply chain logistics. This is of particular concern for agricultural production, and certainly so in advanced economies such as Australia, where a number of agricultural industries rely on access to foreign workers. Further disruptions to food supply chains may increase food security concerns, which in turn can lead to hoarding by consumers. We've already witnessed episodes of panic buying and stockpiling of food and other essential items that can put upward pressure on prices. As the pandemic causes economies around the world to contract, reductions in income and loss of employment are likely to intensify concerns over access to food. Trade restrictions and border closures could destabilise global markets. A number of major food-producing countries have already imposed export bans on certain commodities, while others have sought to shore up supply through import expansion. Food protection policies such as these on a larger scale could accelerate global food price rises. So, what are the potential long-term impacts of COVID-19 on global food markets? That will of course depend on the severity of the pandemic and how long it lasts. One outcome may be the introduction of additional border crossing requirements, similar to the added border checks and security measures that were introduced following the September 11 attacks, and it may lead to higher transport costs. Heightened compliance measures may permanently result in higher trade facilitation costs that reduce or change trade flows. Higher trade costs in particular will affect agriculture and food commodities. Increased stockpiling of agricultural commodities and further implementation of protectionist trade policies could impact trade flows and have implications for global food prices, particularly in thinly traded markets such as rice. Increases in transport costs may result in higher import costs. Disruptions to global supply chains and higher costs Could even prompt companies to think about reshoring production, that is, moving their business back to their home country. And such moves could also be driven by national security concerns. Relatedly, shifts by countries towards greater self-sufficiency may lead to changes in commodity demands. So, are we heading for another food crisis? Well, if national governments increasingly implement protection policies that restrict global flows of food, then significant food shortages are likely to occur. How will global food markets adjust once we come out the other side of the pandemic? It's difficult to predict. However, it is likely there'll be structural changes in demand and supply of agricultural commodities and adjustments made to global food supply chains.